Okay, so when we think about the Great Depression, the picture that usually comes to mind is, well, economic collapse, despair.
Right, widespread suffering.
And this idea that everyone basically turned to the government, demanding bigger government, the New Deal, to fix everything.
That's definitely the standard narrative we get. But the source we're diving into today, David Beito's Taxpayers and Revolt, it paints a really different picture, or maybe a complementary picture.
A counter-narrative, almost.
Yeah, you could say that. Beito shows that while, yes, there was despair, the Depression also sparked this huge grassroots backlash against big government, a reassertion of that traditional American skepticism of state power.
So not everyone was asking for more government intervention. Some are actually fighting against it, particularly against taxes and spending.
Exactly. They saw the problem not just as economic failure, but as, fiscal irresponsibility and political corruption run rampant, especially at the local level.
Interesting. So for this deep dive, we're going to unpack that story using Beito's research. We'll look at how regular citizens, particularly in places like Chicago, which were just, fiscal disaster.
Completely bankrupt.
How they organized to challenge the system, demanding fiscal sovereignty. Really, it wasn't just complaining, it was organized resistance.
And rooted in this deep belief, going way back, that, taxation without real consent or restraint is basically tyranny. That's the core idea we'll explore.
Okay, so let's set the stage. This revolt didn't just, pop up overnight in 1929. The groundwork was laid much earlier, right? During the supposedly prosperous 1920s.
Absolutely. That's crucial. While the federal government was actually paying down debt in the 20s, state and local governments were going in the opposite direction. They were quietly racking up enormous amounts of debt.
How much are we talking about?
Well, Beito cites figures showing per capita state and local debt jumped over 50% just between 1922 and 1929, from about $90 per person to almost $138. That's a huge increase.
Wow. And how were they doing this? Weren't there debt limits?
There were, but they found ways around them. A key tool was something called tax anticipation warrants.
Right. Explain those. They become really important later, especially with the banks.
Yeah, they're basically IOUs issued by the city or county. They'd sell these warrants, often to banks, promising to pay them back with future tax collections, money they hadn't even collected yet.
So it let them spend now based on taxes they hope to collect later. Sounds a bit precarious.
It was. It worked okay as long as tax revenues kept flowing reliably, but it created this dependence on future collections. And even in the good times of the 20s, there were signs of trouble.
Like what?
Like rising property tax delinquency. In Detroit, for example, the rate went from 4.5% in 1921 to 12% in 1929. People were already struggling to pay before the big crash.
So the system was already creaking. The Depression just pushed it over the edge.
Exactly. It exposed the fragility. And when the economy collapsed, the burden of that government spending suddenly became unbearable.
Not just the dollar amount, but the share of people's income.
Right. That's the killer statistic. Taxes as a percentage of national income, which was obviously shrinking fast, almost doubled in just 3 years, from 11.6% in 1929 to a staggering 21.1% in 1932.
21%.
That's unbelievable.
It was unprecedented. And local taxes were a huge part of that jump, doubling their share too, from 5.4% to 11.7% of national income. Imagine your income is slashed, and then the government demands twice the proportion it did before.
You can see why people would revolt. And the main focus of the anger was the property tax, especially on real estate. Why that tax in particular?
Well, several reasons why it felt so unfair and hit so hard. First, it had zero connection to your actual ability to pay at that moment. Owning property, especially a heavily mortgaged home, didn't mean you had cash after 1929. But the tax bill was the same.
Right. Unlike income tax, which adjusts with income.
Exactly. Second, homeowners couldn't really pass the buck. If you owned rental property, maybe you could try to raise rents to cover the tax, though that was hard too. But a homeowner just had to pay it directly. And the third point, which seems crucial for the public nature of the revolt, you can't hide a house.
You absolutely cannot. Unlike, say, income or savings, real estate is right there, visible, immobile. So if you defaulted, everyone knew. Before the Depression, that carried a lot of shame.
But then things got so bad, the shame kind of evaporated.
It shifted. When suddenly huge numbers of your neighbors are also defaulting, Beito mentions the median delinquency rate for major cities hitting over 26% by 1933. The individual stigma fades. It becomes a collective problem.
And that sheer scale of default basically broke the state's main enforcement tool, right? The tax sale.
Completely. If thousands of properties are up for tax sale, who's going to buy them? The market for distressed properties collapses. The threat loses its teeth.
So the tax almost becomes voluntary.
That's the term Beito uses, a discretionary payment. If the state can't effectively force you to pay, and you see masses of others not paying, the calculation changes. People start thinking, wait a minute, why should I pay into the system that feels broken and corrupt?
Which leads us to the ideas behind the revolt. It wasn't just economic desperation. There was a real ideology there.
Oh, absolutely. The resistors drew consciously on a long American tradition of what Beito calls anti-state doctrine. They saw themselves in the line of, say, the Jacksonian Locofocos from the 1830s.
The Locofocos, remind us about them.
They were a radical wing of the Democrats back then, pushing for strict laissez-faire. They believed government should basically stick to courts, police, defense, and not meddle in the economy or individual lives. Very limited government.
So the 1930s tax resistors picked up that mantle, this idea of a constrained state.
Yes. Their core philosophy was that government had vastly overstepped its legitimate bounds. They feared any expansion beyond those minimal functions, and crucially, many didn't just want lower taxes. They argued that excessive government spending and debt had actually caused or worsened the Depression.
That's a radical claim, directly opposing the New Deal idea that government spending was the solution.
Totally opposite. Their argument was that government needed to deflate, just like the private economy was being forced to, cut spending, cut taxes, get out of the way.
This sounds like it sets up a kind of class struggle, but maybe not the one we usually think of.
Exactly. It wasn't Marx's capital versus labor. It was drawing on ideas like John C. Calhoun's, a conflict between tax spenders and net taxpayers.
Okay, break that down. Who were the tax spenders?
In their view, this included the politicians and bureaucrats, especially those in corrupt machines who benefited from bloated payrolls and graft. It also included municipal bondholders living off the interest paid from taxes. And significantly, they often included the non-tax-paying voters who supported the political machines in exchange for favors or relief funded by others' taxes.
And the net taxpayers.
These were the people actually bearing the burden: homeowners, shopkeepers, small business owners, farmers, the productive citizens, they'd argue, who felt they were being forced to support this expanding, often corrupt state apparatus. They saw it as political coercion versus voluntary cooperation.
But was there any counter argument presented or acknowledged by the resistors that maybe some of that 1920s spending was necessary? For roads, sewers, schools, things that benefited everyone.
That's the big tension, isn't it? From the resistors' perspective, as presented by Beito, that argument didn't hold much water. They tended to view almost all government spending through the lens of potential graft and inefficiency.
So deep skepticism about the state's ability to do anything right.
Pretty much. Their default assumption was that private enterprise or voluntary groups could provide services better and more morally. While they undoubtedly used the roads and their kids went to the schools, their philosophical stance was that the cost, especially when filtered through a corrupt political machine, wasn't worth the benefit, or that the benefit could be achieved without the state's heavy taxing hand.
And if you wanted a poster child for that kind of government bloat and corruption fueling a tax revolt, you couldn't do much better than Chicago in the late 20s and early 30s.
Oh, Chicago was ground zero. It was just chaos. You had Cook County with, get this, 446 separate government bodies, all with the power to tax something.
446, that's unbelievable.
It's staggering. And riddled with corruption. One journalist at the time just called the whole situation the tax racket. That sums it up.
And the specific thing that really blew the lid off, the catalyst for the big organized revolt, was this assessment scandal in 1926.
Right. A review of property assessments revealed what many suspected, that setting property values for tax purposes was deeply politicized and corrupt. Tax fixing was basically an industry.
How bad was it? Were assessments just all over the place?
Completely arbitrary. Beito found assessments ranging from as low as 1% of a property's actual sales value to over 100%. It depended on who you knew, your political connections.
But here's the part that still seems weird. The properties in the Loop, the central business district, were often overassessed compared to the average.
Yeah, that sounds backward, doesn't it? Loop properties were assessed at about 74% of value, while the county average was only around 36%.
Why would the machine stick it to the big downtown businesses? Wouldn't they want their support?
It was shrewd, cynical politics. The machine's power base wasn't in the loop. It was in the neighborhoods, with hundreds of thousands of ordinary voters. Soaking the big corporations or wealthy loop property owners didn't lose them many votes.
Ah, I see. Tax the few heavily to keep the burden seemingly lower on the many, thus protecting the machine's electoral base.
Precisely. It gave officials immense power over the wealthy while appearing to spare the average guy, even though the whole system was fundamentally broken and wasteful.
But then came the breaking point for everyone, the strong plan. This sounds like the final straw.
It really was. The city's finances were in complete meltdown. Warrants weren't being honored. Teachers weren't being paid. The Strawn Plan was this desperate measure to fill the gap. It demanded taxpayers pay 3 years' worth of taxes, 1928, 1929, and 1930, all within a compressed 16-month period.
3 years of taxes in 16 months during the Depression.
Yes. And each bill was progressively higher than the last one would have been. It was just impossible for vast numbers of people. That sheer audacity, that demand, is what pushed people from grumbling to organized mass resistance.
Enter the Association of Real Estate Taxpayers, AED. This group really spearheaded the fight in Chicago.
They formed quickly and became incredibly influential, led by a guy named Thomas G. Pratt.
So who is he?
He was a professional PR guy, actually, knew how to organize and communicate. He was also an advocate of Henry George's single tax ideas, which focus on land value taxes. His opponents made a big deal of his $20,000 salary, trying to paint him as just enriching himself.
But AED wasn't just about PR, right? They had a clever legal strategy.
Extremely clever. They dusted off a provision in the old 1870 Illinois Constitution, the Uniformity Amendment.
Uniformity. Meaning?
Meaning it required all forms of property, both real estate and personal property, to be taxed proportionally. Personal property means things like furniture, jewelry, stocks, bonds, stuff that's easy to hide.
And nobody was really paying tax on that stuff anymore.
Exactly. By the 1930s, the personal property tax was basically ignored, a dead letter, as Beito calls it. It accounted for a tiny fraction of collections, maybe 13-14%. It was just unenforceable, especially in Chicago's corrupt environment.
So Oretti's argument was?
Their argument was, if you're not taxing personal property uniformly, as the Constitution requires, then you can't constitutionally tax real estate at its full assessed value either. It violates the uniformity clause.
Brilliant. It gave a legal justification for resisting the real estate tax.
It did. It allowed them to frame their core strategy not as lawlessness, but as a constitutional challenge. Their advice was simple. No taxpayer should pay $1 of the 1929 tax until the Supreme Court rules on its validity.
And they made it accessible for ordinary people too, right? It wasn't just for big corporations.
That was key. For a flat fee, something like $15, ART provided professional legal representation to challenge the tax assessment. It democratized legal resistance, bringing a tool previously used mainly by the wealthy within reach of the small homeowner or shopkeeper.
Now, the city officials, like Mayor Cermak, they tried to dismiss ART members as just being rich tax dodgers, right? Wealthy people trying to avoid paying their fair share.
That was the official narrative, absolutely. Pushed the idea that it's just greedy elites. But Beito actually went through the court records, the lists of people who formally joined ART's lawsuits. And the reality was stunningly different.
Okay, so who were the members, really?
Well, forget the stereotype of millionaire industrialists. Proprietors, small business owners, grocers, laundry owners, shopkeepers, they made up over 17% of ART's membership. That's way higher than their share of Chicago's overall population, which was around 5%.
So the very definition of small, independent business people were flocking to this.
They were clearly overrepresented, feeling the pinch badly. But here's the most surprising finding, the one that really demolishes the rich tax dodger myth.
What is it?
The single largest occupational group within ART. Skilled blue-collar workers, carpenters, painters, plumbers, electricians, mechanics, they constituted 30% of the membership.
30%. Blue-collar homeowners.
Yes. These were the backbone of the city's working middle class. People who own their own homes, maybe a two-flat where they rented out the other unit. The very people the political machine supposedly represented.
That changes everything. This wasn't an elite movement at all. It was genuinely middle class, even working class, people pushing back. It shows the depth of the anger across the board.
It completely validates the idea that this was a populist revolt against perceived fiscal exploitation by the state. It wasn't just about ideology, it was about survival for many of these families.
Any other demographic details that stand out from Beito's research?
Yeah, a couple more. Women made up at least 26% of the membership. Often widows or single women whose main asset, perhaps their only source of income, was a piece of real estate they'd inherited or invested in. They were incredibly vulnerable to these tax hikes.
And financially, were these people actually wealthy?
Not at all, by and large. The median residential wealth of an IRET member was calculated at just over $7,000. Modest homeowners, small proprietors, skilled workers. These were the net taxpayers Calhoun talked about, organizing to defend themselves.
Okay, so you have this massive, genuinely popular revolt brewing in Chicago, led by IRET, and threatening to spread. This must have sent shockwaves not just through City Hall, but also through Wall Street.
Oh, absolutely. Panic is probably not too strong a word, especially for the banks and investment houses holding all those tax anticipation warrants we talked about.
Because if the taxes weren't collected,
their warrants become worthless paper. You're looking at massive defaults on municipal debt. Banks like Chase National, Lehman Brothers, Bankers Trust, they had huge exposure, so their own financial survival was suddenly tied to defeating the tax strike.
So they couldn't just sit back. They had to get involved in pushing people to pay.
They spearheaded the counteroffensive. Along with municipal reform groups who genuinely believed in efficient government but needed tax revenue to fund it, they launched the National Pay Your Taxes campaign, the NPYTC.
This sounds like a major PR effort.
It was huge, and they very deliberately modeled it on the propaganda techniques used during World War I to sell Liberty bonds.
What was the message?
The core message was, paying your taxes is patriotic. It's your civic duty. Therefore, not paying your taxes is unpatriotic, selfish, akin to being a slacker during wartime. They wanted to reframe the entire debate away from government corruption and towards individual duty and obedience.
What kind of tactics did they use? Slogans?
Lots of slogans. Things like, take your trade where the taxes are paid, essentially encouraging boycotts of businesses owned by tax delinquents. They gave out window stickers like badges of honor for people who had paid up, trying to create social pressure.
But it got more intense than just slogans, right? Particularly in some cities.
Oh yeah. It escalated from persuasion to pretty aggressive shaming and coercion tactics. The example Beito details from Newark, New Jersey is just extraordinary.
The Sale of the City campaign. Tell us about that.
Right. The mayor there basically mobilized all city employees. Policemen and firemen were given lists of delinquent taxpayers in their neighborhoods and sent out to visit them personally.
Wow, having a cop or a firefighter show up at your door asking why you haven't paid your taxes, that's intense pressure.
It's incredibly intimidating. These are figures of authority, people you rely on in emergencies, now acting essentially as debt collectors for the city. It blurred the lines in a really uncomfortable way.
And they didn't stop there in Newark, did they?
No, they had telephone operators constantly calling delinquents. And maybe the most insidious tactic, they put labels on milk bottles delivered to people's homes that said, "Have you paid your taxes?"
On the milk bottle, right on the breakfast table.
Exactly, bringing the public shaming right into the private sphere, into the family home. The psychological pressure must have been immense. The goal was to make non-payment socially toxic.
And all this was happening while the campaign tried to paint the resistors as the bad guys.
Yes, simultaneously, they pushed this narrative that the tax strike wasn't a legitimate protest, but was either anarchy, sedition, or just a conspiracy of the wealthy, directly countering the reality we just discussed about IRET's membership.
They were comparing them to gangsters, even.
Yes, comparing them to gangsters, wartime slackers, enemies of the state, anything to delegitimize the idea that challenging taxes could be a principled stand rooted in American traditions of liberty.
Now, there was also an intellectual argument being made by the state's allies, the reformers. They weren't just saying pay up, they were offering an alternative vision of government, weren't they?
Right. This is where the idea of constructive economy comes in. The reformers, academics, good government types, municipal experts argued against what they saw as the tax rebel simplistic destructive economy of just slashing budgets blindly.
So what was constructive economy?
It was about efficiency. Making government work better, not necessarily smaller in absolute terms, reducing the unit cost of services through expert administration, scientific management, taking politics out of governance.
So professional managers running things, insulated from political pressure, and presumably corruption.
That was the ideal. But the crucial point for them was that to achieve this efficiency, the experts needed a reliable, unrestrained source of revenue. They couldn't have unpredictable tax limits or strikes interfering with rational planning.
So it's a fundamental disagreement. The rebels want to limit the state's power to tax on principle, while the reformers want to empower the administrative state with reliable funding to achieve efficiency.
Precisely. And the reformers and their financial backers used modern media to push their view. There was a primetime radio series called You and Your Government, produced by the National Advisory Council on Radio and Education,
Which was heavily funded by
investment bankers, the very people holding the municipal bonds.
no conflict of interest there then.
None at all. The show featured academics and public officials talking about the virtues of constructive economy, expert administration, and implicitly, the need for stable tax revenues. An NBC executive at the time actually questioned the bias, saying something like, practically all these people live off tax money, why not give the guy who pays a chance?
So the airwaves were dominated by the pro-government, pro-tax message.
Largely, yes. They hammered home the idea that the alternative to their expert-run state was chaos and anarchy. The American Municipal Association put out statements challenging the resistors. Try sending a letter across the country for 3 cents without the post office. Try building your own roads.
Painting a picture of societal collapse that the tax system failed.
Exactly. Making the case that modern life depended on these large tax-funded government functions and that resisting taxes was essentially trying to turn back the clock to some impossible primitive state.
Okay, so despite this huge propaganda effort and the psychological pressure, ARRET and the Chicago tax strike held on for a surprisingly long time.
They did. It shows the depth of the discontent. They really gummed up the works for about 2 years. But ultimately, the political system decided that persuasion and propaganda weren't enough. They resorted to legal force.
Changing the laws to specifically target ARRET's strategy.
Precisely. In April 1933, the Illinois state legislature passed a couple of key laws. The first was the Graham Act.
And what did that do?
It struck right at the heart of ARRET's legal shield. It mandated that taxpayers had to pay 75% of their disputed taxes up front before they were even allowed to challenge the assessment in court.
So no more pay nothing until the court rules. You had to pay most of it first, then argue for a refund later.
Exactly. It made mass legal resistance financially impossible for most people. You couldn't afford to pay 75% of a potentially inflated bill just for the chance to fight it. It killed their main tactic overnight.
And there was a second law passed around the same time.
Yes, the SCARTA Act. This one targeted income-producing properties, apartment buildings, commercial properties, the kind often owned by ARRET members.
How did it target them?
It gave judges the power to appoint receivers for any property that was delinquent on its taxes. These receivers would basically take control of the property, collect the rents, and use that money to pay off the back taxes.
So direct seizure of assets, effectively.
Pretty much. It bypassed the owner entirely. Between the Graham Act, taking away the legal strategy, and the SCARTA Act allowing asset seizure, the state created powerful new coercive tools. There was even a third law making it illegal to incite tax strikes.
So the state just changed the rules to make the protest illegal and impossible.
That's essentially what happened. Combined with some internal disputes within ARRET was eventually pushed out, and the fact that federal RFC loans started to ease the immediate financial crisis for the banks holding the warrants, the organized strike basically collapsed.
So in the end, did ARRET actually achieve anything? Did the revolt make a difference?
It's mixed. On the one hand, they definitely failed in their larger goals. They didn't fundamentally change the tax system or roll back the size of government in the long run. Tax limitation movements largely failed nationally.
But they did have some impact.
Yes. Particularly in the short term in Chicago. The pressure absolutely forced significant budget cuts. Beito notes Chicago's city budget fell by over 35% between 1930 and 1933. That's a substantial reduction, a direct result of the pressure.
But overall tax collections still went up eventually.
They did, partly because they were collecting multiple years' worth of back taxes once the strike was broken. So the total burden didn't really decrease long term.
So why did this powerful, popular movement ultimately fizzle out after 1933? What was missing?
According to Beito's analysis, while they were incredibly effective at mobilizing against high taxes and wasteful spending, they lacked a clear, positive, alternative vision. Meaning they were great at saying, cut this/that, but they didn't offer very concrete proposals for how essential services should be delivered differently. If you cut the school budget drastically, what's the alternative? How do you ensure fire protection or policing if you gut their funding?
They didn't have a plan for privatization or alternative service delivery that was convincing.
Not a well-developed or unified one. They were united in opposition, but less so in proposing workable, ends-oriented solutions. citizens. And into that vacuum stepped the reformers with their constructive economy argument. Keep the services, just run them more efficiently with experts and stable funding. That argument ultimately proved more persuasive in shaping policy.
But even if the organized movement faded, Beito argues the spirit behind it, that deep-seated American skepticism of big government, endured.
Absolutely. He sees the whole episode as a powerful reminder that the anti-state tradition didn't just disappear during the Depression. It was alive and well, forcing citizens who might have previously ignored local government to become intensely tax conscious.
To actually question what they were paying for and whether it was worth it.
Exactly. And to see the inherent conflict that taxation creates, that Calhoun dichotomy again, between the net taxpayers bearing the burden and the tax consumers benefiting from the spending, whether they be bureaucrats, bondholders, or recipients of state services.
So the revolt, even in failure, was a reassertion of that fundamental American idea of fiscal sovereignty, the idea that government serves the taxpayer, not the other way around.
That's the core takeaway. It demonstrates that the 1930s weren't monolithic. Alongside the calls for more government, there is this powerful parallel movement demanding less government, more accountability, and fiscal restraint rooted in founding principles.
It's fascinating how the state and its allies tried to define patriotism purely as obedience, just pay your taxes, don't ask questions.
While the taxpayers were drawing on an older tradition, going back to the Revolution itself, or the Whiskey Rebellion, arguing that true patriotism often requires vigilance against government overreach, especially fiscal overreach.
So we've taken this deep dive into a hidden history of the Great Depression, seeing this massive tax revolt as proof that the anti-big government sentiment was incredibly strong, driving people to organized resistance against what they saw as a corrupt tax racket.
It really challenges the simple narrative and highlights this enduring tension in American political thought.
And maybe it leaves us, and you listening, with a provocative thought. The Chicago taxpayers in the 30s were forced to confront a fundamental question. At what point does paying taxes shift from being a necessary civic duty, funding essential functions, to becoming unwilling submission to a system that feels exploitative or illegitimate? Where is that line, and how do citizens ensure government stays on the right side of it?
It's a question that never really goes away, does it? Maintaining that balance between funding necessary public goods and protecting individual liberty from excessive state power, that vigilance the tax rebels embodied, remains pretty relevant.
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to the deep dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shaped liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.